Breathing more heavily or deeper during strenuous exercise is your body's natural response to bring in more oxygen. Oxygen is needed in the final step of cellular respiration so that your cells can continue producing ATP for energy. But when this is not possible, your cells have to switch to something known as anaerobic respiration, which is respiration without air or oxygen. Sometimes it's called lactic acid fermentation because lactic acid is the byproduct or the waste product of this process. Lactic acid is responsible for the burning sensation that you feel in your muscles. There are two types of anaerobic respiration. They are lactic acid and alcoholic fermentation. The products of fermentation are involved in making alcohol, such as wine, beer, spirits, vodka, and also dairy products such as cheese. It is believed that the Neolithic people, such as the ones who lived in Mesopotamia, were the first ones to discover alcohol. They stored grains in pots, which naturally had small populations of yeast living in the pots. When it rained, the pots collected water, and the yeast naturally started to consume the carbohydrates in the grains. In the process of converting grain into energy, the yeast produced alcohol as a waste product. The Neolithic people then discovered that they could drink the liquid in these pots and it would make them drunk. Animals gone wild. They get drunk too. So you'll see in this footage how some of these animals are consuming a marsala fruit which has been left on the ground for several days. So what the animals don't know is that the fruit also has yeast inside of it, and the yeast has been eating some of the sugars, and in the process of consuming the sugar they release alcohol as a byproduct of alcoholic fermentation. So the animals don't know that the fruit is packed with alcohol, so they start to get drunk. Look at that elephant there. He's wobbly. The giraffe is prancing around. The hogwarts here have no idea what planet they're on. This ostrich is about to fall over. And these animals are just wildly drunk. The discovery of cheese was most likely accidental during ancient times. People found that fresh milk would quickly go sour in the open when exposed to heat and sunlight. The lactic acid would cause the proteins in the milk to clump. People then found that they could drain off the liquid portion known as whey, and the remaining clumps could be eaten because those were the cheese curds. So let's try to understand what makes a cell undergo fermentation as opposed to cellular respiration. So all cells can perform glycolysis just fine. That means taking the glucose that's consumed and splitting that up into pyruvate. So the pyruvate then enters a citric acid cycle, which we discussed before, and that produces 2 ATP. And the protons and the electrons are then carried by NADH and FADH2, and they're funneled through the electron transport chain. But the problem is, if you have no oxygen, that means you can't remove the excess hydrogen ions and the electrons. And as a result, the electron transport chain fails. So without the electron transport chain, you can't produce the bulk of your ATP, which comes from cellular respiration. So again, if you have no oxygen, that means you can't have cellular respiration. So how does a cell get around this and produce ATP? It needs a way to make emergency ATP, and it does this when it undergoes fermentation. So remember, there are two types of fermentation. There's alcoholic fermentation and lactic acid fermentation, which is produced in animal cells. And fermentation just recycles a molecule called NAD+, and this allows glycolysis to continue in a loop. So we'll discuss the details in just a moment, but remember, glycolysis can always make 2 ATP from splitting glucose into the 2 pyruvate molecules. So this is how it creates its emergency ATP fund. So let's talk about lactic acid fermentation, which occurs in muscle cells. So lactic acid is the waste product that's produced, and this causes the burning sensation in your muscles whenever you're exercising really hard. So during glycolysis, you start with a 6-carbon glucose, and glycolysis just means to split sugars. So this sugar is then split into 2 molecules of pyruvate, each with 3 carbons. So what happens next is, to produce your ATP, NAD+ has to be converted into NADH. You will always get 2 ATP from this process. But how does it allow glycolysis to continue? So what happens next is the pyruvate undergoes lactic acid fermentation. So the NADH, which is carrying energy, converts pyruvate into lactic acid. And when it does this, it actually recycles the molecule NAD+, and NAD+ then returns back, and this helps you perform glycolysis. Okay, so you're just recycling the molecule NAD+, which allows glycolysis to continue. And when you always have glycolysis, that means you always have at least 2 ATP. Alcoholic fermentation is very similar to the lactic acid fermentation that we just discussed. So again, both of them start with glycolysis, which means you break your sugar down. So your glucose has 6 carbons. You're going to break it down into 2 molecules of pyruvate. And if your cells realize that it has no oxygen and it's starved of oxygen, it will undergo fermentation. So alcoholic fermentation is performed by yeast, for example, and certain types of bacteria. So under this type of fermentation, you're still going to see the NADH become NAD+ because it supplies the energy for this process. Okay, no ATP is actually produced from fermentation, but it does recycle NAD+, and it makes alcohol as a waste product. So you get 2 molecules of alcohol and 2 molecules of carbon dioxide. So alcoholic fermentation is actually responsible for the bread dough rising, right? So as yeast performs fermentation, it makes CO2, so it causes your bread dough to rise. That's why bakers use yeast whenever they're making bread. So now the NAD+ gets recycled, and it returns back to glycolysis, because glycolysis needs this molecule NAD+, because that allows glucose to be split into pyruvate, and in the process of doing that, it creates ATP. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed learning about fermentation. Fermentation is just how cells produce emergency ATP when there's no oxygen around to continue cellular respiration. There are 2 types of fermentation. There's lactic acid fermentation. This is performed by muscle cells, and the waste product is lactic acid, which causes the burning sensation in your muscles. The other type is alcoholic fermentation, and this is performed by yeast. So yeast will produce ATP in this process, but it also leaves behind alcohol as a waste product, and humans have actually discovered that you can create beer and wine from alcoholic fermentation. I hope you've enjoyed watching some of the animals get drunk and fall over. I'll see you next time on Win Biology.